Hello there. Good to see you again.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me back.
Hi there. Obviously, I think you were referred. Sorry, I start again. I've interviewed you before last year,
Mhm.
and that was a really good interview, very insightful. But a lot's changed culturally and actually politically since then, which we'll get
Yes.
to in a minute. But for those who didn't watch the first interview, can you just explain who you are and your journey up until this point?
Sure. So my YouTube name is Baggage Claim. I've been a content creator on YouTube for coming up on, no, I'm more than 4 years now. And the whole purpose of my channel is to try to do deeper dives on issues that impact us culturally. And a lot of those issues end up getting reflected in media in the form of movies, TV shows. So I try to get to the bottom of the cultural issues using TV shows as example or movies as example. For example, uh, the Marvel series got completely co-opted by a very different style of writing than we're used to in Hollywood, and I think that's a really big significant when it comes to trends that we're seeing and how people are thinking about things. How are people thinking about feminism, female representation? How are they thinking about men and their role in our society, but also in government? So it's interesting that a lot of that gets reflected in writers' room. So those are the kind of analyses that I try to do.
You said there about Marvel writing becoming co-opted, and obviously it's not just Marvel's main blockbuster franchises that have become co-opted, like Star Wars and Star Trek, for instance. How did that begin? Like, how did that start?
So one of the interesting things about the evolution of feminism, if you go back all the way to when it started in the 1800s when the main push was for the ability to vote. And then in the 1970s, it became more about independence, financial independence for women. So can women get their own bank accounts? How do divorce proceedings end up working out? Are they always going to be in favor of men, or is there going to be a balance? And then in the 90s, with the third wave of feminism, it evolved into become more a perspective on gender in general. It became about how even the concept of being a woman is something that is ephemeral and something that is really up to the individual. So that's when gender studies ended up becoming kind of combined with feminism, and then they, really merged with trans communities, things like that. Now, with where we're at, is we're in the fourth wave of feminism, and I think we're pretty quickly going to cross into fifth wave, is my perspective, but that's a little complicated here. So, fourth wave feminism has actually gained mainstream influence. So fourth wave feminism really isn't living in textbooks or anything academic. It's instead in the writers' rooms because of the push for representation. So that's something we hear all the time when Hollywood executives are talking, that, oh, representation matters, diversity matters. So that has impacted hiring practices, where instead of hiring based on talent related to storytelling, has become about hiring based on belief systems, representing a certain ideology. And so in that push, someone who aligns with fourth wave feminism is more likely to get hired. And then that's why a movie like Snow White gets made, where then Rachel Zegler comes out and parrots sort of the writer room ideology and says, even though she had no hand in writing the movie herself, she says, we've written a movie that is completely different. And but it's because it's that style of groupthink, that everything that womanhood has been traditionally, of what she has represented, of even what Snow White represented, is now going to be undone. It's not about love, it's about power, it's about seeking power, it's about pushing for women in leadership positions and directing societies and directing power structures. So that's really what the fourth wave feminism is about. And we see that everywhere, where it's as much it's really about pushing down men out of the conversation, and that it's women-led stories with almost no interaction with men unless they're villainous in the story. So even the concept of love, according to this new perspective, is that love is an inconvenience. It's a burden on women. So that's why Rachel Zegler said, It's less about her love story, right? She made sure to really say it's really not about that. It's about power. So that's how we've gotten here, is that most big Hollywood production companies, their writer rooms are, and I'm going to say they're infected with this type of thinking.
Yeah, it seems to be the case. And they infect it with established franchises. Why haven't they decided to develop their own franchises? Why have they co-opted other franchises to get their message across?
So a lot of what's interesting is that feminism really merged, I think, in the 70s with the idea of everything's about power. It comes down to that idea. So now, if you look at life through that lens, you don't believe in charting your own way. You try to dominate what already exists because that's what you think men did to women. And like, that's the perspective. It's like men did that to women, America does that to the rest of the world. Like, that's the viewpoint that they really rely on, that marriage is not about a union between two people to have a stable home for children. No, marriage is about power. It's about enslaving women and tying them in this institution and like preventing them from leaving. So that if you have that kind of perspective, then you're not going to respect someone else's work. You're going to try to destroy it. Because we would happily support, and I just mean the general audience, we would happily support stories specifically written for women, brand new stories that tell great tales. We would love that. But it's not about that. It's about coming in and destroying what already exists out of anger that these feminists feel against men. So it is designed to destruct.
Yeah, indeed. And yet, from a box office point of view, what you're starting to see over the last 18 months to 2 years is, from a box office perspective, they're not not gaining the money that they used to gain. And yet, this still continues. Do you think we've reached a tipping point now where this is where it's going to start falling, or are we far away from that yet?
In the past, I thought that we had already reached the tipping point, and I thought that people would be willing to walk away. And yet I don't think, we're still able to, they're still able to recognize sort of the folly of their approach. They've lost billions. Previously successful franchises like Marvel, Star Wars, I mean, they're almost dead in the water. It is fascinating how they can transform something like that. You can see certain attempts to reverse the damage, like the bringing back of the Russo brothers into the Marvel franchise, and now they're going to be directing the Infinity Saga. But I wonder if the damage can actually be undone that easily as just bringing in these two directors. Here's why I say that. Woke ideology in general is very hard to argue against on an individual basis. It's very easy for someone to immediately accuse you of being a racist or being bigoted, and then make it impossible for you to argue back, because it's a perspective-based thinking, and it's not like a fact-based thinking. So, for example, if I say to you that your behavior feels sexist, you can't really argue that with fact and say, listen, I have no problem. You might say, like, I have no problem with women. I look at them equally. And I'll say, it doesn't matter what you think or do. I feel this way. And the woke ideology believes that how you feel is more important than fact. And so if someone says, this is my lived experience, and if an ideology says that's valid, it is impossible to argue with. How can you change someone's perspective on how they feel? You can't argue. So if the Russo brothers are sitting in a writer's room and having a discussion with what the script should look like, and one person says to them, I don't think that you're being very accommodating to various sides, various perspectives. I feel rejected. I feel othered in this conversation. How exactly would the Rousseau brothers argue back against that without possibly losing their job or having a scandal. It the what I mean is that woke ideology is specifically meant to put people on the back foot and force them to walk on eggshells to try to sort through these rules that are very convoluted. And that's not an environment where art can be created. Anything good can be created. What's weird, actually, like what's very hard for people to realize is that art gets created through adversity. You have to have arguments, you have to have discussions, you have to have intense disagreements to try to come to an answer of what is going to be the highest quality, what is going to be great. People have different visions for that. And you know what? When you have different visions, when you argue it out, the hope is that the best one wins. And that means that the other person's going to have hurt feelings. You need hurt feelings for progress to happen. But if an ideology says that hurt feelings means game over, and that whoever is the most hurt in a conversation is the one that deserves the greatest accommodation and care and consideration, there's nothing good that's going to come out of that discussion. It's only going to be, people just saying like, okay, you know what, whatever you say, people will back off because they know they can't win that fight. And I think that's what's likely to continue to happen. They can try to make some top level changes, but until they get that whole ideology out of their writer rooms, this is going to continue to happen. Everything, and I think Chris Williamson had said this, that people pander to the lowest woke denominator. And that is true. So that's why it acts as an infection, where one person in that room can actually direct the energy that everyone else is feeling, because they're willing to take it nuclear and say, I feel terrible, I feel awful, I'm going to take this to HR. They're willing to do that. And the thing is, on an individual level, you have to choose not to do that. You have to choose not to actually give in to your baser instinct of like trying to control other people based on how you feel, because you can control how you feel. You can say, I can choose not to be hurt by this. I can choose not to feel like this is a personal attack. I can choose to instead look at the facts, look at the intellectual aspect of it. But if you don't choose to do that, and in fact, you're encouraged not to do that, then you will win every argument. And again, if the purpose is domination, if the purpose is to gain power, isn't this just the easiest way to do so? So that's why I don't think that the tipping point has come yet, because I think people are still getting their head around how to argue against this, because it is that pernicious in effect.
But isn't there a point where you have to say, if you get enough people to have the courage and say, enough is enough of this, then actually you will start to turn the tide? Because especially with discrimination, and I'm not saying it doesn't happen, of course it does, but I look at what people think is discriminatory now, and the bars become so much lower that surely is going to be a time where people say, you know what, enough is enough of this. I know I'm not racist. I know I'm not sexist. If I make a mistake, I'm not doing it on purpose. So if this carries on, well, screw you, basically. I know what I feel in my heart, in a sense. Um, wouldn't there be a point where if enough people start saying that, then those people pandering to the ideology will say, okay, maybe we've got to change, or either change the way we do things, or at least try not to be as bullish as they were?
I think that's definitely happening on a societal level, where people are pushing back against the common narrative more and more. Uh, so I'll give you a quick example. On a political level, there is an issue in a small town, Springfield, Ohio, where there have been 50,000 migrants bust in a town that I think, it's I think the town is only 20,000 people. So that's a massive distortion for a town to have suddenly an influx of migrants from Haiti. And a lot of people went and complained at their local town hall meetings. And they said, listen, we're not racist. We just know that this is a different culture, and it's a culture clash. And that is, we have no problem with people coming here and becoming Americans, but this is completely different. This is actually a cultural takeover. And so that conversation, that ability to stand up for oneself, didn't exist 5 years ago. People didn't even understand the difference between culture, having a problem with someone's culture versus having a problem with someone's race. That was a point that was very easily conflated and very hard to argue. And I think people are understanding that. And that's wonderful, because that will help people realize, like, that a culture needs to be preserved, not just other cultures, even American culture needs to be preserved, British culture needs to be preserved. That doesn't mean that there needs to be some form of racial purity. It just means that you have assimilation happen at a much slower level. But if you have a mass influx, it completely changes the local culture. And that's important to pay attention to. Just like none of us would support, 500,000 people being sent to some city in India. We wouldn't support that. We would say, no, wait, that's going to completely mess up their infrastructure. It's going to debilitate them. So I think people are understanding that better now. But when it comes to Hollywood specifically, they exist in a completely different world. They're so big that they've turned into this bubble where whatever parties they're attending, they're having their own thoughts parroted back. And this is one part that's really hard for people to get their head around, is that we're very social creatures. If, I'm very confident in what I believe, and I feel very capable in communicating what I believe in like the nicest way possible, because that's what I do for a living. I write for a living. I think about these problems for a living. But even I get very nervous telling some of my San Francisco friends about what I really believe about things or who I'm really voting for, because in that case, I'm one amongst 100 who disagree with me. And the ability to stand up to that is almost impossible. Some people can do it, they really can, but I can't do it. I feel fearful in that moment of, what are they going to think about me? What are they going to say to me? Am I going to be, massively rejected by my community? Because it is San Francisco, that's where I live. So that's the same issue in Hollywood, is that someone might not agree that this is the right course to chart on an individual basis, but they're surrounded by other people that are forcing that way of thinking. So everything keeps failing at the box office. And there's this pattern that they have. They come out with a trailer, and the trailer is just panned for being terrible for whatever reason, and then immediately there are headlines from news sites that say this movie is not for you, or this show is not for you. It's a script just set up at all times, and Nerdrotic does a great job of calling this out. And the purpose is to tell you that you're not important. It's like, we don't care about you as an audience. And they're trying to seek an audience that actually doesn't exist en masse. It doesn't. They did the same thing with Acolyte. Acolyte comes out, it's terrible, and they say, it's not for you. It's not for you. But it's so significant, and the critics love it. And it's because they're all part of that same bubble. And what happens? The numbers are not there. So it gets canceled. When it gets canceled, all the stars come out, they're disappointed. And the news report is like, oh, it's a shame that audiences are so racist, so sexist. So if you have that line of belief, where is there room for you to be willing to change your mind about anything? And if all your friends that you're surrounded with tell you, yeah, you're right, the only reason Acolyte got canceled is because people are racist and sexist, and Star Wars fans are toxic. That's the only reason. So if you exist in that kind of bubble way thinking, you're never going to evolve. And that's one of those things that people don't realize, that on an individual basis, if you're not willing to change your mind about something, you are going to keep making the same mistakes in your life over and over. And that's exactly what Hollywood is doing. It's just that they're going to destroy themselves over time. I think Hollywood is not really going to recover. There's going to be a new something, the medium of film and TV show is going to survive, but Hollywood is not going to survive.
That brings me on to a very good point, because what we've talked about it could be encapsulated by the word wokeness, which seems to be a very overused word over the last decade. But I just wonder, well, is it overused? Do we overuse it too much, where actually, because sometimes I'll watch some TV shows and it's good characterization, but I think, oh, there's a black character in there or someone disabled, oh, it must be woke. Do you understand it? I almost over exaggerate it. Do you think that happens sometimes?
Uh, the pattern is so strong, and human beings do pattern-based thinking. I do agree that it might be a little overused, but actually, I'm trying to think. I'm challenging myself. Do I think it's overused, or do I not think? I think it's an ideology that is active, that needs to be called out. It's in the same way that they'll constantly bring out, like, oh, the radical right. They'll call the radical right out, and I think it is like it can turn into boogeyman thinking. But at the end of the day, if it encapsulates people's ideology, then I think it's an accurate representation. That there are certain types of things you see from a woke TV show, woke storyline, which is, the women are empowered, overly empowered. The men are constantly presented as foolish and idiotic. You'll have instances where the women are not coupled with men, they are coupled with each other, and there's a great disdain for the men, or the woman is like raising her child as a single mom, and the father is considered a deadbeat dad. And then if there is any positive male representation, it'll be in the form of like some kind of out of the box, like they'll call it like, oh, this person is deaf, or this person is, that's the only way that they'll represent a positive male character, is if they are not white. Really, it just comes down to that. And I think if you are looking at things in that black and white perspective, that falls into woke ideology. And what you were describing is something I was doing when I was watching House of the Dragon, where I was expecting it to be really woke. And when I saw a black character, I said, oh, great, they're just gonna, super empower him. And like the white character is gonna be terrible. Or same with the women are gonna be great, the men are gonna be terrible. And it didn't turn out to be that at all. And I had to correct myself. I said, okay, you don't have to look at everything at that kind of lens. And it's kind of refreshing to just have a good story, and it's entertaining. I know there are some issues that people take with it as well, the ones who've read the book, but in general, I'm enjoying that it's not caught up in that nonsense.
Okay. I'm all for solutions. And you have companies like the Daily Wire, they've released some stuff. You have Eric D. July, that's obviously released his own Rippaverse comics as well.
Mm.
And one of the things I think we've witnessed, and especially cancel culture, is yes, both of them are very real, but I'd be more sympathetic if this was 20 years ago, where you didn't have the technology to circumvent the cancel culture. So, for example, if you get a book that's banned in the major retailers, then obviously you can self-publish. And I
Mhm.
just wonder, do you think there's enough people that are actually exploring that alternative media as a way of circumventing that? Because as much as we complain about it, there doesn't seem to be enough people, I think, especially over this side of the pond, who are actually using the technology to actually circumvent it and get away from the major corporations.
I think with some aspects, it is easy to circumvent. So in the cases of book publishing, uh, graphic novels, things like that. Where it's really difficult is when it comes to movie making, because movie making is such a coordinated um, project. You need so many resources. Whereas with the book, you write it, you can get it published, you're good to go, and you can promote it through social media, no problem. With movie making, and it's an interesting experiment to see how Critical Drinker's movie is going to get received, because he has such a massive audience. He has a very dedicated audience, and he has found a way to crowdsource his his project. I don't know when it's coming out, and I'm curious to see how that ends up doing, because I think that will be a great example to other people, a great template, and a great sort of promise to other creators who also wish that they could break out of the system and create something good, because there all these visionaries, and there's demand for good storytelling, but the supply is almost run dry, to be honest. So if he does a great job, which I really hope he does, where the movie's well received, I think we'll see more people willing to take that risk on an individual level and try that out. But I can see why that there feels like this great big barrier right now, whereas the studio system was conducive to this. Like, you didn't have to, on an individual, as a filmmaker, you didn't have to figure out every little detail. You had a system that you could rise through and then get the opportunity to spearhead your own projects, right? It was a whole system designed to get something good out. Right now, what are the paths exactly? I think there will be more of a rise of smaller production companies, definitely. We're already starting to do that, but is it going to be the same kind of widespread impact that we saw with art before? You know, it's like, you think about it, even like 20 years ago, there would be a movie and like everybody went and watched it. Everybody was talking about it. You know, Shrek, like even if we'll talk about something like Shrek, everybody was quoting it. I mean, it became part of the culture. And you don't really have those instances anymore. It's more like on an individual level, someone will like something. The whole idea of like one movie has mass appeal has almost evaporated. So I think that's the question, is like, what is distribution going to look like in those instances? You know, is it just going to be side projects? Is it going to be, you know, one person just like has their niche audience and they like it? And in the same way that celebrities that have mass appeal are going away, instead, you know, people just have social media stars that they like. And, you know, there's no one with really, really wide appeal. Maybe Mr. Beast is a good example. Mr. Beast also has a niche audience. It's just that it's, you know, it's pretty big. But that's what I'm curious about, is like, what is that future going to look like? Is it ever going to have that widespread impact?
I agree with you in regards to it's easier with some art forms than others, so especially something like the theatre, which is expensive anyway, to try and crowdfund something like that. I would say go for it. And you could possibly crowdfund it if you're popular enough, but then it's just finding the space and so on and so forth. And I know we were talking just before the interview, I said I'm aspiring screenwriter, I have these ideas. And it can get a bit demoralizing when you see things on TV. I'm not a jealous type. If I see something that's good, I want to learn from it. I want to get the script from it. I want to see, oh, what techniques do they use and so on and so forth. But it gets demoralizing when you see such absolute tosh and you're thinking, and I'm not saying I'm brilliant, but how on earth has that managed to get on screen? And I
Mm.
just wonder, will you get a stage where certain people just get demoralized from it? Because it will almost be like you say at the beginning, it won't be based on merit, it'll be based on, well, if you fit a certain immutable characteristic, or if you're writing a particular story that hits all these characteristics, then you'll succeed.
I think the impact of demoralization, it kind of exists on all levels, whether an industry is working well or not. You have to always on an individual level be fighting that demoralization. Like if you look at even Joss Whedon, he was at the top of his game when he was directing Age of Ultron, but the project was so hard on him because of all the studio requirements that he ended up getting demoralized and ended up taking a break. And then he got canceled for other reasons, but otherwise he would have returned. I think whether you're getting demoralized because you're not getting the opportunities you would like, or that you're getting the opportunity you like, but you're not having the breath to do what you want, it is a daily struggle to kind of accomplish what you want to accomplish. So I'll give you an example for this, right? For for many years, I was just working in sort of the startup space, and I was really fighting with myself to try to be a certain way in and do well in that space. But half my head was constantly thinking about video essays I wanted to write, because really that's what I wanted to do, and that's the stuff I was thinking about all the time. So I left that life and I started a YouTube channel, and I've been fighting to try to make it as successful. And like sometimes it feels like, oh, I've reached some kind of pinnacle of success. And then suddenly the algorithm changes and my videos go from getting 200,000 views guaranteed with each published schedule to suddenly 30,000 views, 40,000 views, you know, and that gets very demoralizing. But the point is that I have to find a way to make it work. And I think that is the true perseverance, that like if art gets created through that adversity, right? People
Mhm.
like you're looking at how terrible the screenplays are, you know, you're committed enough to the art that you're going to find a way, and you're going to think of something completely different, and people like you are going to come up with a completely different way to get stories out there. And I think that's what Hollywood is going to have to deal with, is that they're going to become so irrelevant that their next release is not even going to be a blip on people's awareness. At least today, every time there's a new movie, there's a new TV show announced, whatever, there are people discussing it. but in not so distant a future, there's not even going to be a discussion. And I think the industry is going to shift towards talent. It always does. That's the truth. It's always going to head to better pastures, because that's, at the end of the day, people are craving something real. People are craving something good.
Speaking of better pastures, I know we've talked about movies a lot, and I'll continue with this theme. There seems to be, from the indie scene, a lot of really good films that have come out recently. So, for example, a couple of weeks ago, I went to see the film The Substance with Debbie Moore, which I've watched. I think it was Chris Goran film for it. He said it could be Debbie Moore Oscar nomination because she's that good in it. Um, with a lot of body horror, that sort of stuff I like. But would you agree that indie films actually, there seems to be a bit of a renaissance, because a few years ago that scene seemed to go quiet, whereas now you seem to be getting more indie films in the cinema.
I'm going to defer to Chris Gore's judgment on this, because this is something he had said to me. He said that's the industry that really needs to get built out. That's what he sees as the future. And I'm not as, informative about those sort of trends, but he has said that that's also his dream, is to empower indie films, and which is why he's always so tenacious about reviewing indie films that come out, because most other critics are ignoring it because they want to stay in their bubble. They don't want anyone outside of that. And I think he is a great force in that. And I hope that that continues to rise, because like you were saying, you're seeking that kind of work as well. And I think indie films can give hope and homes to people with real talent.
Is there a danger with wokeness and art that, as much as it's a significant issue, they overshadows other significant issues that are happening in art that also need to be solved? So, for instance, um, the price of cinema, in terms of that's increased as well, or with theatre, that's always been a problem, but that's never really been sorted. My hometown, going to be libraries closed because of cuts. Do you think it sometimes becomes so overwhelming that it actually focuses too much attention on that and not enough on other issues that you could argue are just as significant?
Oh, yes, or more so. I think the obsession that woke ideology has with things like representation, or manufactured racism or sexism. I'm not saying that racism and sexism don't exist, they do, but this is a common line that people say, is that the demand for the racism and sexism is much higher than the actual supply. So it gets manufactured. And in the film Am I Racist, by the Daily Wire, that Matt Walsh made, he talked to a woman who assumed that a character who had, a mascot type character who had this like big costume and head on, didn't see her two children when handing something out at a parade. And so she accused them of racism because she's Black and her children are Black. But one could just assume that with the costume on, that man or woman, whoever was inside the costume, could see someone standing at his level, but not two children standing way below his his sight line. And I think that's what it is that our perspective is so stuck on wanting to catch racism, that we see it even where it could easily have not existed. And so that sort of distraction then from far more important issues that are troubling people every day. So even if, let's say, it is racism, at the end of the day, your children just didn't get handed something. It's okay. You can hug them and say, it's okay in life, these things happen, and you move along. But what about people who are suffering and living on the streets? In a first world country, we have such a massive homeless issue because we have a societal issue of how we are lost. We are actually extremely atomized, and families are broken, like divorce rates are out of control. People do feel lonely. There's a loneliness epidemic going on in America, but we're not tackling those sort of issues. We're not tackling drug issues. We're not like addiction to drug issues. We're not tackling like intense depression and anxiety amongst children. Like these are all things that are far more important, but instead we're overly captured by that if there's a cast in a film, oh, how many Black people or how many brown women are in that movie? Really, is that the obsession that we need to have over building a much healthier society? Just because someone is or isn't in a movie, it doesn't move the needle. What matters is, are citizens suffering? Are people suffering? And what can we do as a society to fix that? So I completely agree with you. I think it's a massive distraction, and it's a way to get ahead of the line. Women can use this if they parrot the right ideology, if and say, well, I belong in the writer's room of a Star Wars film, even if I haven't proven myself as an adept script writer, but I belong there because I can parrot this ideology, and get pushed ahead of the line. I think that's a very damaging approach.
Isn't it damaging as well? Because it just shows a lack of self-respect that you want to actually get into these roles because of immutable characteristics. Like when I wrote my book a few years ago,
Hmm.
I was happy that people liked the book. They didn't like it because I happened to be a Black writer who wrote it.
Right.
And I don't know, maybe it seems to me that some people seem to have a lack of self-respect. If you're that desperate
Hmm.
for attention that you're just you accept that, oh, people will like your work of because of your immutable characteristics, and not actually because of the blood, sweat, and tears you put into it.
Yes, I completely agree. I think if someone said that about my work and were only interested in it because of certain characteristics that I have no control over, I would find that so insulting. As if I need some sort of pity or help to just do well. Why is my effort not being looked at? Why is my ability not being looked at, but instead my skin color? And I think it's completely antithetical to what Martin Luther King Jr. had said, that we have strayed so far away from the vision that he had for America, and specifically around race relations, where he was trying to get us to a colorblind society. And that's exactly what America achieved in the 90s, is that we became colorblind and sex blind. We said, women should be promoted just like men should be. There should be equality on that front, and people of all colors should be promoted based on their ability. And now we've gone from that to F white people. It's gone to like completely like, let's beat down white people. And it is turned into a movement of hatred. It's turned into a movement of pandering. And when you create this kind of environment, then charlatans who know they're not talented, they know they don't have ability, they misuse the system, they actually use the system to get ahead. And you're right, it's a complete lack of self-respect, but it's those type of people that try to manipulate a system to get money and get more money and get more attention. I really like that in Am I Racist? Matt Walsh showed in all instances, he kind of brought on race baiters who charged for their services. They charge for these lectures and sessions that they hold, where they make people who attend these sessions acknowledge their white privilege and white pride, and are like almost willing to self-flagellate themselves for the sake of this ideology. And I love that he showed how much each of these charlatans charge in coming down and sitting down with him, or holding these sessions. It's like, this is when you rig the system this way, when you turn the system against quality of work and quality of character, but instead you make it about what someone looks like, what someone parrots, what kind of ideas they parrot, then you're going to create a system that the worst type of characters are going to get the most amount of rewards. And that's why people don't understand that, why meritocracies are so important, is because it preserves the sanctity of quality of people's character at the end of the day.
I spoke to someone fairly recently, and I was talking about technology and young people, and I was saying that growing up as a teenager in the 90s, even if you weren't part of a group, you were aware of it. So you were aware of like people who were goths or hip hop heads or house music heads or indie kids. Now, part of it's because I'm older, but even when I'm going into city centres, I see a more homogeneity amongst young people.
Hmm.
I don't know whether technology plays a part of that. I don't know if it's the same in the States. Do you think that's the case? Because there seems to be no distinguishable groups, or everyone seems to be the same somewhat in terms of young people.
I don't know if I haven't been exposed to that. Yeah, I think the only thing I can really say about it, because I don't think I'm well versed on what exactly is happening now with young people. I think the big thing is that, children want to fit in, children, and then social contagion can really take over. And so if you are in a time where something could get you sort of intensely rejected, which didn't really exist in the like you were saying, in the 90s when you were growing up. So for me, my experience of it was I'd moved to the States in the year 2000. So that's when I grew up, was like in the first decade of the century. I grew up in America, and there were differences in how people talked, how people, thought, and people would group still in like how they still grouped a certain way, but you could see a lot of distinction. And then you see an interview with these two girls from college where someone says, are there two genders? And one girl says yes, and she's trying to finish her sentence, and the other girl's stopping her. She's like, no, 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 you don't say that, you don't say that. And that's what I think has really changed, is that you could have a sort of more diversity of thought growing up. You could get rejected for it, but it wasn't as intense as it seems to have become now, is my thing of it.
Okay. Um, I mean, hopefully there's some green shoots from this. We've
Yeah.
talked about how alternative media as well. We've talked about other things as well. What are some green shoots from this? In terms of culturally, are there any green shoots you look at and you think, oh, actually, that seems positive going forward, or that seems positive going forward? Because at the moment, when it comes to culture, there's a lot of negativity around it.
Hmm. I think um I think people are learning to defend values a lot more that we sort of took for granted before. For example, even the idea of freedom of speech is massively under attack right now. And if you go up to someone, if you'd gone up to them 5 years ago, they might just not really, they would say, oh, well, it's important, but they wouldn't know necessarily why. Um, Same with even the idea of culture, like I was talking about earlier, is that people wouldn't know why to defend the importance of culture before. And now, because of the introduction of long form media, people are being forced to sort of think through their thoughts a lot more. I think critical thinking really dipped down very low over the last couple of decades, and now it's being sort of forced into this upswing, because we're seeing, when a society sort of falls asleep and stops thinking as critically, that's when bad people take over the government and they start wreaking havoc for their own, own gains. So that's why it's that adage, exists, that weak men create bad times and bad times create strong men, and strong men create peaceful times. And so the cycle kind of continues. So I think we're in that period where this is where it's asking people to really rise up and understand the fundamental issues that we need to be arguing for. So what are our values as a nation? Because we're so polarized, but why does freedom of speech matter? Why does honesty matter? Why does truth matter? Like, there are all these aspects of being American that people are really confused about. And I think we're going to have a period of coming together. What's also happening, another green shoot, I would say, is that institutions that have taken their power for granted and their influence and control over people for granted are seeing just how weak their grip over people is. Hollywood is a great example of that. The mainstream media is a great example of that. The mainstream media had everyone's attention not so long ago because of cable news, because of, all these other avenues. But now, Joe Rogan gets far more views than someone like, Rachel Maddow, or, so the decline of mainstream media is also being just made even more rapid by their insistence on propaganda. They're not telling the truth. They're not giving the audience an opportunity to think through things. They're just prescribing answers. Whereas Joe Rogan doesn't do that. Joe Rogan is having long discussions. They're purposefully not edited. It's kept very simple to give, at the end of the day, give people an opportunity to think. And he talks to everybody. He talks to everyone, and it is a very open discourse. That kind of discourse has never existed before. Especially in this form of like it's accessible by everyone. Maybe it had existed in the form of like sit downs and people could attend and listen to these lectures or anything, but it has never existed in this like mass form that it is now. And I think it's giving people an opportunity to think through really complicated things and internalize them. And I think that's going to help herald in a much better age than what we're living in now.
Do you think this long form podcasting, because it's not just Joe Rogan, it's other things like trigonometry and Chris Williamson and other podcasts. Do you think that's catching in a way the mainstream news media out? Because what they see as long form is basically 15, 20 minutes at times.
Yeah.
Whereas now I think people are getting used to those long form in depth. And you see with certain journalists that don't know necessarily how to cope. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yes, I don't think that journalists even have ever had the opportunity to think that way. You know, Chris Cuomo is an interesting sort of defector from mainstream media because he was part of, I believe, MSNBC. I forget if that's what he was part of, but he was part of the attack on Joe Rogan back when COVID was taking place, and there was the whole issue about taking ivermectin, which is an easy drug to take, to like access. It was very inexpensive, but it was helping people with COVID. And Joe Rogan was talking about it on his podcast, and Chris Cuomo called him out and said, you know, you're taking horse dewormer, which was absolutely false. And you know, there was all these attempts to sort of censor Joe Rogan, because at the end of the day, the mainstream media is in the pockets of big pharma who don't want you to take cheap, easy to access drugs. They want you to take expensive drugs so that it puts more money in their pockets. So, and for mainstream media, the biggest advertisers are big pharma. So you can see that mix of that. If there's no personal morality that directs how you handle your profession, then you're easily in the pockets of anybody who's willing to put the biggest paycheck in front of you. That doesn't mean that anybody who's sponsored is you know, corrupt. It's that, do you take sponsorships that align with your vision for the world, or do you take sponsorships that change the way you do your job, that change the way change who you criticize as a journalist, or what kind of propaganda you put out? And I think mainstream media, because they had achieved such a great power, you know, power corrupts. And at that point, they said people are going to believe anything we say to them. And a lot of people still do, but that number keeps dwindling every day. Whereas Joe Rogan, who's playing the long game, he's not playing a game necessarily. I'm not saying he's manipulating people. When I say long game, I mean he's doing what he believes to be morally right. No one's going to sway him away from that. And what he believes to be morally right is to expand to explore the truth. What is the truth? To bring in as many voices as possible. If he agrees with them, doesn't agree with them, he's open, he's honest, he's very clear cut about it. And that ends up serving as a great long game, because it only serves to enhance your audience, because people see that at the end of the day, you have integrity. Now, if you play the short game where you say, you know, since big pharma is giving us money, let us help them and maintain their chokehold over the US population in a time of a pandemic. If you do that, what are you doing? You're eroding trust with your people. That's the short game. And it might work for the first month, might work for the first year, but after 10 years, you become irrelevant. It's the same thing happening to Hollywood. So I don't think they know how to deal with someone like Joe Rogan, because they sold out their integrity years ago. And there's no crawling back from that. Even Chris Cuomo is trying, but people are not letting him forget how he behaved during that time. It's the same with Mark Zuckerberg. Mark Zuckerberg is trying to rehabilitate his profile, his persona with people, and his reputation by saying, you know, coming out and talking out against all the censorship that the Democratic party insisted that Facebook execute on. But at the end of the day, he sold out his integrity. So now if you're just because you're coming out and talking about it now, it doesn't change the reality that you were complicit in that censorship. So where's the apology? Where's the atonement? You can't just, overnight rehabilitate your image. So I think that is the big issue that all of these people don't realize, is that once your reputation is damaged, it is very hard to fix it.
Last point, and again, we'll all end on a positive, and this is more about yourself. Give you a chance to big yourself up, because you said you've got your own state, your YouTube channel, and your writing. So, what does the future hold for both of those?
I think right now, when it comes to the YouTube channel, I'm just trying to do as much as possible to help with this election. I want to just help people think through issues as much as possible. I don't want to tell people how to vote. I just want them to help. I just want to help them think through things themselves. And so I'm going to keep doing YouTube because it is an exciting time in that way. It's stressful, but it's an exciting time. And then as for the, you and I had talked about this offline, is that I've been working on a book. Specifically, I want to tackle our social incongruity in a sense that we don't know what it means to be an American. And that's a question that I've been asking myself since I moved here when I was really young, is that what does it mean to be an American? And I want to try to answer that through a book. And I'm very excited about that.
Oh, cool. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Baggage Claim, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much for having me. I always feel like you ask such engaging questions, such thoughtful questions. So I appreciate it.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much.